conversation.
Okay, all right. Let's get this party started. Okay, so first, some administrative stuff. During the talk, try to keep your mic muted. There are a few people that I've designated as discussants, just so that Jess doesn't feel like she's just talking into the void. So that there's some kind of spontaneity in terms of questioning. However, if you may have noticed, we have a lot of external guests, and this is clearly Jess Finley's fan club that kind of follows her around as she goes. So Brent has the band hammer, so he'll be muting people as necessary. He's also a discussant. Marlene Hurst will also be discussing, and Stefan Peterson will also be chiming in with quality questions. Which means I have to do less. I just kind of sit back and let everyone do their thing. Today we have a very special guest, Jess Finley. She is an instructor and is it founder as well of the Ritterkunst Turnhall?
Yeah.
In Lawrence, Kansas. She is a very rare breed of HEMA practitioner that has a very broad view and practice of Kunstfestens, and as you can see by kind of the fan club that follows her around, it's a very topical and very in demand nowadays. Today she's going to be talking about a lot of the context and allegory of Kunstfestens, which is but a small piece of her research agenda. So without further ado, Jess, take it away.
Hello, everybody. So I think I want to go ahead and begin by just sharing a little bit about me and where you can find me. So there's all of my info there. As Charles said, I teach at and did found the Ritterkunst Turnhalle, which is just our little training space here in Lawrence, Kansas. I've been training HEMA in some varieties since February of 2003. And before that was swinging swords at Renfest, so since the 90s. So I've had an interest in swords pretty much my whole life, and that's broadened out to basically make me interested in almost anything 15th century, which is really too broad for any one human, but you know, I give it my best. So what I want to say about this is, given that, I've talked about some of these things at various talks, like at WMAW or Long Point and other places online, and so some of you have seen some of this stuff in some form or another, but Leonard, I'm trying to think of his last name. I haven't been able to think of it today. Leonard's a old martial artist, and by old I mean like in his late 70s. He shows up to WMAW, and after my last talk, he said to me, Jess, this is multiple like master's level classes that you just try to do in an hour, and it's too much. And I went, oh, that's why it's not making sense to anyone. I got it. Like I'm trying to get across too much, and this is like more than that. So so what I want you to do with this then is I'm trying to present to you enough Cliff's Notes that you can go, oh, here's the piece I'm actually interested in, and then either you and I can have a conversation about it at another time, or you can take it and run and do your own research and go berserk on whatever is interesting to you. And so because of that, I want to kind of make this super conversational. I don't want to just talk at you guys for an hour, though Lord knows I can talk for a really long time about this stuff. But I think it would be more fun if it was a little bit directed by interests that you guys have as we go. So the people that have the rights to ask questions, please feel free to be like, whoa, Jess, hold up, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I could go off on a tangent if we need to. So hunting, what does hunting have to do with anything? Especially if we're thinking about in context of HEMA. For today, I'm going to keep it really general, just talking about hunting kind of in a medieval context. At some other time, we could talk super specifically about all of the crossover between the fencing language for KDF, or the German, the Liechtenauer tradition, and all of the crossover between terminology and maybe what that means to our actual interpretation of the thing. But for right now, let's just talk about hunting and what hunting looks like in a medieval context, and who was hunting and why. So first up, hunting is, at least by the 15th century, but for hundreds of years earlier, always associated with the nobility, the knightly class and up. And what I got you here is one of my favorite little pieces that's out of, if you're familiar with the Danse Macabre, right? The idea of all of the different classes of medieval people being paired with death, and that person in death having a conversation. I thought it was appropriate to open with this since it's plague time and all that. But all of the different classes of people being taken down by death, and it's kind of this memento mori idea that we're all going to die, and it was a really common theme. And this particular one is the Danse Macabre of Women. It's a French manuscript. I can get you guys bibliographical notes if you want it. But here, death is saying to the wife of a knight and describing her specifically by her love of the hunt. So that if you were to think of the knightly class, if death was to come to the knightly class and say, this is the one thing I know about you, this is the thing death came up with. So for the medieval people, the hunt was very much an association in that way with these classes. The hunt was a social event as much as anything else. And so that's why we're going to kind of take this through some of the other things that the knightly class might have been up to in addition to fighting. But so you might expect, if you were to get together yourself and all your knightly dude friends, then everybody's also going to bring their wives and girlfriends. You're going to pack a picnic, right? You're going to bring your hawks because you're going to show them off, which is in some ways analogous to showing off fancy cars in today's world, especially with regards to how much they cost. So it's almost like you were getting together, you're eating outside, you're drinking wine, you're maybe, flirting, and all sorts of weird romantic hookups are happening, and you're gonna go kill an animal. So what does that part of it look like? The hunt could be thought about in a variety of ways. There's a lot of different hunts. The main one is the chase, and so the chase can be on foot or it can be with birds. But let's go ahead and talk about, in general, I'll be describing it on the ground for now, but we can talk about birds as well as we go on. So first up, you're going to send out your masters of the hunt, and your game masters, and they're going to go out, and this is being done on land owned by you or one of your buddies, right? Game preserves where you would go hunt were privately owned things. So again, this is a very class focused thing. So your master of the hunt will go out maybe the day before, maybe a couple of days before, and be like, okay, there's a couple cool stags, they're over here, I'm going to make sure to kind of corral them in some way. And sometimes they would do that by actually setting up fences, or just kind of drive them to a certain area where they go down and lay down to sleep. And the master of the hunt would be, cool, these guys are harbored now, we know where they are. So tomorrow when my lord is like, hey, let's go get that cool stag you mentioned, I know where it's at. And so part of the hunt wasn't figuring out whether or not there are game, at least for the night, right? That was somebody else's job. When the knight gets involved is when they would unharbor the game. That is versetzen. if you study the German stuff. And it's rousing the animal up from where it has been harbored, whether it was naturally there or whether it was put there by the masters of the hunt. And the animal has then started up and begun running, and we can assume stags. So the stag bolts off and starts running down the path. Now you may have set up dogs ahead of time, these relays, that once the chase begins, you'll always have fresh dogs to keep driving the animal exactly down the path you want, because the master of the hunt will have planned this whole thing out ahead of time as much as he could, so that he can kind of guarantee success for the nobility. And I'm not a fan of like modern rich people going to Africa and killing big game, but I mean that's kind of what this was. It was a similar idea for people of a certain class and with a lot of money. So anyway, so they would have these dogs all set up so that they would have fresh dogs to constantly harass and be at the heels of the stag, and the stag would be doing its best to get away basically at this point, and everyone is chasing either on foot or on horse depending on what they had all decided for the day, and they're going to go to wherever they've decided they're going to kill the animal. Once they're there, in the end, they will, and that's going to basically happen whenever the stag has reached a point of exhaustion, or the animal has reached a point of exhaustion where it recognizes that running will no longer save it. It can't get away. Its only chance is to turn around and fight. And is at that point that they engage the animal, and the dogs are helping. Everyone that's involved with spear, swords, horse, sometimes crossbow, we'll talk about that in a second, they then engage the animal in the actual fight to the death at that point. Once they've killed the animal, there's certain rituals for how it is, how it's slaughtered, who gets what pieces of meat, and this changes over time and in specific exact location. And when you go looking for information, as I'm assuming you're all gonna do, but if you go looking for information on 15th century hunting, note that Germany, or the traditions in the German lands, were separate from those in the French and English. So like we like to often look to like Gaston Phoebus for our medieval hunting information. That's where a lot of these images come from. And it's absolutely good to look at. But when it comes to the ritual of the hunt, of who gets what pieces and when the dogs are fed and which dogs are fed what and which humans get what, it's very different in Germany than in the other places up until the 16th century, when the German lands decided to adopt the English traditions for the hunt. Okay, so if you're looking at 16th century hunt traditions, it might be different than earlier. So yeah, just something to know. Is there any questions on that? Does that make sense? I'm sure it does, because it's really pretty straightforward.
What were some of the key differences between Germany and France or England?
You know what? I don't want to speak off the cuff about that. Because I would screw it up. Beyond knowing that it was different, but it was literally like, it was things like there might be like you would give like the lead dog the heart of the animal, right? In some places, but not in others. Things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just like different ranking behaviors, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I have not spent enough time with that to speak just, right now off the cuff about it.
My gut is German seems to have more dogs and less horses.
I'm sorry,
like
say it again.
Talking, like there seems to be a lot more discussion about the dogs and a lot less use of horses when we've been talking about your interpretation, like you're looking at the treatises. I feel like the using the horses to direct prey happens more in other places, and Germany is a lot more about the dogs.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I would. I don't know that I would say that.
Okay.
Certainly, Gaston Phoebus has a whole lot about the dogs and how to train them and feed them and take care of them and all those things. So you know, the dogs are important in the hunt as a tool that are deployed in specific ways, and each kind of dog has its own job in the hunt, and they would breed them up and train them in this way. And again, like the super specifics are beyond me on that. Likewise, if you were to engage by falconing, right? So by sending either a falcon or a hawk or a gyr falcon or an eagle, you know, not a lot of people had eagles, but some did. You know, if you were hunting with that animal, it would still happen in more or less the same order. It's just the bird would be doing the chase portion of the hunt and the end portion. Well, maybe. The bird would be doing the chase portion for sure. So the harboring and unharboring would again be the masters of the hunt. And sometimes you see that, you'll see it in the backgrounds of images of guys with sticks hitting bushes, and birds are coming up from it, right? So that would be the versetsen of the bird, or of the prey birds. And then you would be throwing your hawk, literally throwing your hawk or falcon at them. And that could be done from horseback as well. So in some ways, the use of the bird is reminds me of like using a spear, you know, but that's, you know, that's just me. And then so as far as falconing goes, it's kind of cool. In all of the hunts, there are desirable there's desirable game and more desirable game, because each game was ranked, if that makes sense. And so you might hunt a rabbit, for instance, but that would be a pretty low ranked animal because the animals were ranked on its ability to kill you back. So in hunting on foot, you would be hunting a stag or a boar or a bear, right? Something that's gonna when it turns to fight, it has a good chance of killing you as well as you do it. And that's a very knightly thing to do. Likewise, you could send your falcon after turtle doves, which is just fine, but that's more just to get meat. Whereas the top prey animal to send your falcon against would be a heron or a stork. So really a quite big animal. And there's a lot of talk in the falconry texts about how to do this and kind of how badass it is when your peregrine falcon hits a heron out of the air. And they will have an aerial battle the whole way down. And the heron has a really good chance of killing your hawk. These hawks were ridiculously expensive. Again, I'm talking about like fancy car levels in modern parlance. And so you really didn't want your falcon to die in this. So one of the things that they would do would be to train up greyhounds, for the purpose that the greyhound and the falcon were trained together, so that whenever a falcon hits a bird and brings it down, the greyhound is there the moment that the two birds hit the ground and finishes off the prey bird and leaves the falcon alone. So there's a whole lot of really cool hunt stuff. A couple other methods of hunting that are worthy of mentioning. The bearson, which is hunting with bows and stable, which is where that you would drive the animal into maybe into a hedge or into a fence, and from there the huntsman would be waiting ready to kill the prey with bows or crossbows, long bows or crossbows. or you could obviously trap or net animals. But again, kind of these are going down in badassness, if you will, right? The most badass is the chase, followed by Bearson, followed by trapping.
Was there a type of hunting that was considered more appropriate for women versus men, in addition to the scaling of badassery?
Yeah, right. As far as I understand, women were just as involved in falconry as men. That seemed to be, everybody was into that. Whereas the actual, the chase on foot, where you are, where you're killing them maybe with a spear or a sword at the end, there don't appear to be women at the end of that. They might be involved in the chase part, but once the animal turns, I never see women depicted anymore. But certainly falconry is available to women. Cool. So hunting is very much associated with knights and knightly virtues, and we're gonna, continue on with that. A couple of things, just another couple of things I wanted to mention. Dom Duarte, the Book of Horsemanship. If you look in here, he talks about how to be a good rider, how to ride well in tournament, and how to ride well in the hunt. And he talks specifically about the different tactics you need with spear and sword on the horse, whether you're in tournament or whether you're in the hunt. Excuse me. So there are a lot of cool details in that book, if that's your jam, and you would like to read a little bit more about how this might apply to our physical use of weapons, rather than the more theoretical, esoteric approach to it, or allegorical approach to it is what I want to say, not esoteric. But yeah, that's been really interesting. This is kind of my third time reading it through. I'm rereading it right now, and I'm finding a lot more than I realized previously. And any of you that got to get out to the last night exhibit on Maximilian in New York when it was there last year, I'm sure you saw all of the hunting stuff, because Max was a huge hunter. He loved to hunt, he loved to dance, he loved to fight, right?
Yeah, that was a great exhibit.
It was so good.
And
so
play dress
yeah,
up. He was about dress up.
he was about dressing up. The man was into it. So there are a lot of cool things about Max. He's like my 16th century boyfriend right now. But Toyer Donk, this particular book, has a lot of great hunting scenes of Max being up in the mountains hunting ibex and doing all sorts of cool-ish deeds. Of course, Toyer Donk's kind of a ridiculous hero if you read through the book, but that's, that could be its own talk. But yeah, so there's a lot of cool depictions of nightly hunting in that book, if that's something you also wanted to geek out about. So what got me into hunting in the first place was actually this image here, which I'm sure many of you have seen before. And it's Cal's attributes of a fencer. The Fiorius have their really sweet Segno, and we've got this guy. But you know what? I'm into it, so we'll take it. So he talks about the three qualities we should have. And eyes of a falcon, so one cannot lead me astray. That always pretty much made sense to me, because of course, I just kind of knew that was a thing about birds, that they had really good eyesight, particularly predatory birds. But yeah, okay, so that makes sense. He can't trick me. I'm really perceptive, right? And I'm into it. I need that as a fencer. Cool. Heart of lion, so I strive forth. I was like, okay, cool. That's about bravery. That makes sense. You got to be brave. Feet of a hind. And I was like, why a female deer? That doesn't make sense to me at all. And as well, what appears to be referencing footwork didn't seem to fit to me with the other two overarching ideals of like a quality. So it was actually trying to figure out why the hell would Cal be talking about feet of a hind that got me into the hunting stuff a few years ago. So let's talk about that a little bit. So as I mentioned, falconry is super important. As much as the hunt is associated with the knightly class and things that rich people might be into, the falcons were as well. And I actually kind of love this quote here from Dalby's Lexicon of the German Medieval Hunt. That's that book right there. But yeah, that basically knights and falconry symbols had reached the point of like, oh my God, can we stop with this at this point? Because the falcon was used and hunting with the falcon was used as a metaphor for primarily romantic exchanges. And so your lover would be a falcon, and you would be writing about the care and feeding of this falcon and how you train them up to do all the things you like, and then how they go and hunt for somebody else like a trash bird, right? It's really intense poetry. A lot of fun to read though. But you know, I thought it was interesting that they were, you know, as much a symbol of passion and impetuosity as anything else. So part of, you know, if we're thinking about the eyes of a falcon, part of the training process is something called sealing, which we don't do now, but was literally sewing their eyes shut with thread, which I don't even know how you do, but that's what they're doing in this manuscript image here. And it's part of the training because the birds are so sight focused that in order to keep them calm and train them to just sit calmly on a human's wrist, in order to do that, they had to take away their eyesight. So I think saying, you know, that the eyes of the falcon are incredibly important is kind of an understatement. But that it's through the eyes that we're going to get all of our perception and be able to make our judgment about the situation that we're in. But this is a list of virtues that were given to a falcon in medieval texts. And this is just one list by one guy, you know, talking about how cool his falcon was. And here's all the neat things a falcon has. But this is very much like a list of virtues that one might want for a knight. Yep. Cool stuff. All right. So Heart of Lion. This was the dopiest lion I could find, by the way, if you want to giggle a lot. Like, Google medieval lions, because they you know, for all we think they couldn't draw a horse, they couldn't draw a lion to save their life. Anyways, so Heart of a Lion. We all go like bravery. It's bravery. Lions are brave. That's all they are. Yeah, okay, that's true. That they are proud and very bold. This 13th century dude says. But I thought it was interesting that it says, from far off it can scent the hunter who is pursuing it, and in order that the other may not follow it, it covers its tracks by means of its tail. So there's a certain amount of quality that the lion has beyond just being courageous, but that also it has a certain deviousness in the fight, maybe, or a certain amount of its own perception excuse me, to be aware of the hunter pursuing it, and to cover its own tracks, as it were. So we can see that these are many layered symbols, right? And there's no way for us to know what exact quality that Cal was focusing in on. But I think it's a useful exercise to have a look at all of those and kind of see how you can internalize that for yourself when you're thinking about how you're gonna bring your own fight. which brings us back around to the feet of a hind. In medieval Germany, hinds, being the female deer, right, were an undesirable quarry. Excuse me. They didn't want to hunt them, and because it wasn't particularly knightly, right? Wasn't particularly noble. But the hinds were thought to have this ability to, if you were chasing a stag that had run, that the hind would come back behind it and run back and forth across its trail, and that you would end up being confused and accidentally following the hind instead of the stag. And of course, there's a lot of just like basic medieval sexism layered in here that doesn't take a lot of effort to look at and bring in. But it kind of reached the point to be like the animal which will not be named. And so the word hind dropped completely out of German, and they instead began to refer to it even in hunting texts as either whore, the tierlin, or the dink, right? And dink, thing, is a not so subtle reference to a vulva. So they're like just straight out calling her a prostitute. Which, okay, that's weird and a lot. But then why is Cal telling us to have feet like this? And really what I think he's saying is that he is telling us that we need to have this deceptive quality in our fight, and that with our footwork, we can mislead our opponents, right? And so it's about deception and trickery as much as anything else. Any thoughts on Cal?
Yeah, I've got one question.
Yeah, go.
It's kind of interesting that he doesn't mention physical strength, and it seems that kind of the medieval mind kind of anthropomorphizes animals in kind of a different mapping from what we would expect as modern people. So I guess my question is that kind of what we're getting at then? That there's this cultural mapping of animal qualities that we don't have access to unless we actually dive in like you have and study the sources.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is what I'm saying. And I think even more that there is a cultural mapping for all of these things, right? That that we might have in our just average talk about anything competitive, we might throw in sports references, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basketball, baseball, like whatever you choose. And I think that they are throwing in hunting references to be their thing that they would grab onto and be like, it's like when you do X, and they're like, yeah, I know about that, right? Like I'll always say, for instance, I always say head fake, right? Which is a basketball thing, that sort of thing. So I think that that's what's happening here. And I think additionally, that's what's happening with these animals. We've very much kind of boiled them down and Disneyfied them so that they each kind of have one quality, I think. Whereas, obviously medieval people had access to Aesop's fables, but additionally they had their bestiaries with so many old stories, right?
There are some wild animals.
There are crazy animals. And in some of the bestiaries, they talk about that hinds, I don't know, I probably should have put this in here, but they talk about that like hinds have the ability, like if you shoot them with an arrow, they'll eat dittany, the herb, and it will eject the arrow from the wound and heal
it.
I don't know. But yeah, so like they're kind of invincible if they have access to a random herb. And then sometimes stags have that quality too, depending on which bestiary you're looking at. So that's where I go to, as well as, like, again, Aesop's fables for stories about animals, but I would go to bestiaries, or Isidore of Seville, right? He's also a good person to look at his etymologies, because he talks about why certain animals are certain ways, and he was considered one of the big authors of the time, right? There's a word for this. Does anybody have it? I don't know what it is. He was the expert. There we go. He was the expert that you would go to if you wanted to know about the qualities of a thing. Is the etymologies. For instance, he says that wrestling comes from bears and the way bears fight, and that's who taught us humans how to wrestle.
Sounds like something Paulus Hector Mayer would say.
Right. Or you have Meyer talking about Alber being the poplar tree and then going on and on about that. No, not the poplar. What does he call it? Chittister knows.
Chittister eating
Meyer
his pizza?
says fool.
Oh.
Well, Joachim Meyer says fool. Paulus Hector Meyer says poplar tree.
Okay, there you go. But yeah, so there's that poplar tree reference that is, again, going back to kind of Isidore and what Isidore would say about it. So anyways, but yeah, so that's what all of this stuff is about, and this is why I'm studying this and why I find this relevant because I'm trying to understand if there's an aside in one of our fight texts. Does that aside have a different meaning than the one I might make up about it, right?
Yeah. So Brent here has a really good question.
Yeah.
That builds off of that. He asks, is framing fencing in terms of hunting terminology a consistent thing for the KDF tradition? Do people use other types of allegories later on in, say, the 16th century?
I don't know. I don't know because I mostly don't study the 16th century stuff. I would not be surprised if it were less focused on the hunt, just because of the changing class structure as everything kind of gets topsy-turvy and turned over in the Renaissance, right? One thing that we do see is a movement towards demanding that something be a science and have an entirely different framing, right? So I would expect not. If you were to look at something, certainly late 16th century, I would expect it to be framed as a dialogue. I would expect it to be framed with elements and justifications for those elements. And we're going to talk about some of that with the dance stuff here when we get there. But that would be my expectation. I think that does get borne out to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I kind of narrowly focus my study on the 15th century. So it's hard for me to say for sure. So dancing, as we said, is another totally knightly thing to do. And if we're looking, this is an Italian treatise, the practice or art of dancing. But this is one of the earliest dance treatises. So I got really excited about getting this book because I was thinking about, wow, it's really cool to have another physical art that's attempting to be described in words in the very late 15th century. And what this author lays out is the 6 elements of a good dancer, which are measure, memory, partitioning the ground, air, manner, and body movement. So obviously, maybe obviously, I put the little quote from Liechnar's prologue that all arts have length and measure is the way most of us translate that. And he goes on to define all of these elements and give us a lot of information about them, saying in part, my notes are not showing up. Give me one second, guys. Let me see if I can. No, I can't. Darn. He says, let me get it here in the book. There you go. Okay, so he says of measure that that measure is about having an accord between sound and rhythm, using judgment and skill, and tempered in such a way that the weak equals the strong, right? And he's talking about in a lot of medieval music, they have the idea that there is such a thing as a strong beat and a weak beat, which going into music theory is again a whole nother thing. And Brian Brunsman, have him on to talk about music theory, not me. But right, it's a lot. But he talks about that, and I found that, you know, kind of immediately engaging, that the same sort of kind of word framework of weak and strong being equal and being appropriately, like your reaction to them being appropriately happening according to measure or discernment, right? Of being measured, we might say. Memory should be pretty straightforward, but what he says about memory is that you ought to know all of your dances well enough, i.e. have memorized all of the rules and all of the movements, and in such a way that you can perform it so that it hold up. So that you are sure that you are performing it by judgment and measure rather than being led by chance. And that you should be able to remember what is the beginning, the middle, and the end of every movement. And I find this might, again, be a pretty direct application to our fencing, in that we ought to be able to have we know, right, that you have to be able to remember what techniques you want to perform before you're going to be able to perform them. But I like that he's a little more specific about that, so that it doesn't, so that you're not moving by chance, right? For as much success as you might have by that. On partitioning the ground, because this is an Italian text, he starts talking about stretto and largo, which again are fencing words that we use. But he's saying that you need to know the space within you're required to work, so that all of your steps are of the proper size, so that you end up where you're intending to be, depending on whether your space is large or small, right? Whether the room is big or small that you're dancing in. And he says that it takes much more skill and is much more difficult to dance in, or to partition a narrow place, than it does a wide and open one, right? Which again, it feels very, very related to fencing. Air, manner, and body movement, I don't need to go into, but air, he's talking about being quite nimble and being able to be very light on your feet. Manner is in the way that you're turning your body and presenting it to your partner, and body movement is just your base natural ability. And he like throws a whole bunch of ableist shade about people with disabilities, because it's a medieval text, and so that's what it is to work with. No, I don't have an image for it. That's fine. He does then go on to have a dialogue with a student, with a pupil, where the pupil's saying, yeah, but what about this? And he's going, oh, no, this is fine. These are my responses to you. After he has laid out these elements. And the pupil, as his last question, ends up throwing kind of a whole bunch of shade about these elements, and then even more about the exercises that the dance master has prescribed for everyone to do. And the student is saying, I mean, you've given us the elements, which are just fine. I accept them now. And if I know these elements, then isn't that all I need to know? Why should I fiddle with your exercises? Why should I fiddle with your practice? And he has a long reply, but I want to read one part verbatim. He says, even if you had mastered the 6 aforesaid elements, it would still be impossible for you to know how to perform any of the things without the said exercises, because the player could give you no small trouble, and you would in all likelihood end up with little repute. You would find yourself in the situation of the country priest, who did not know how to read except for his own book, starting from the beginning every single time. That's why these exercises are more important than the elements of which we have spoken, which in a sense is what 3227A is, when he has his little spiel about practice being more important than art, right? And this is an idea that's referenced also in Don Duarte. He talks about practice being more important than art. So I find that really a compelling piece that is tying all of these elements together, that there's this underlying idea about how one should learn a physical art and what we should do with it. It's pretty cool stuff.
I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
I think I know the answer. I'm just going to ask it just in case to see where it goes.
Yeah.
So you reference an Italian dance manual, but we're studying German fencing manuals.
Yeah.
What is the relationship between Italian dance and German nobility, if any?
Yeah. Solid question. So this guy, much like Fight Masters, we know is said to have traveled all of the lands of Germany and also learned their dances. So he was in northern Italy. And why I'm referencing him is because this is something I can get access to, right? That's translated in good modern English, that's in my time. But he certainly has German dances in here and does talk about that. So, you know, one easily could make the argument that it's not relevant to look at him specifically for our thing, but I think I could say that there's certain ideas certainly are pan-European, right? And I think the rise of the dance master is one of those things that is. I don't know, you know, obviously there would be regional dances and regional flavors to all of these things. But as far as I know, this guy is the earliest dance master that wrote a book.
They kind of all encompass like the ideas behind most dance masters. Like I've had the luxury of experimenting with a few folk dances from different countries.
That's awesome.
Yeah, super cool. Like in Georgia specifically, they were very picky and precise about where hands went and feet went, and practice was the important thing. And when you say practice is more important than the art, I'm thinking the art is like that point of improvisation where you know it well enough that you're able to just express and do. And coming up in the dance world, I studied the Italian method, CKDF, and practice was all there was, right? Like you had the same routines every single time. You had one class that was focused on being able to just improv. And even then it was like, but don't worry about this. Like that's not what we focus on. It's literally about practicing and building your techniques. So when somebody asks you to do it, you do it and you do it perfectly each time. So, I mean, for it to be prolific now, it had to have been the primary idea way back in medieval as well, like across multiple countries. You know, it's one of those ideas that's still a base today.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is a touchstone that we really can, you know, still see. That doesn't feel so foreign, I think I would say, right? As some of the medieval stuff is super, super foreign to us. But that one, I think, yeah, I would agree. You know, his exercises, he has his 6 elements. I'll go back up there. He has his 6 elements, but he has 4 exercises. The first is that the musicians are going to play, so whatever dance you're performing is the dance you're practicing, right? Like that doesn't change. But the first exercise is that the musicians are going to play on an even tempo, and you're going to try to dance with them. Then they're going to play on an even tempo, and you're going to try to dance off tempo. And then they're going to play a variable tempo, and you're going to try to stay with them. And then they're going to play a variable tempo, and you're going to try to not get caught on tempo.
It's harder than it sounds. My ballet teacher used to do this to us too.
I think it sounds
so
ridiculously hard.
Dude, it is so hard. Because like she was doing it with specifically with just to, I don't know, provide some context with how difficult this is. She was doing it with a grand battement, which is like the big huge kicks that people do at the bar, right? So
Yeah.
you're just throwing your leg, and usually you do that on the upbeat, right? So it's like up and then down, right? She had us do it on the opposite beat, and it just like threw the entire class. And like we were relatively advanced too, and all of us were just like losing our minds because we couldn't make our bodies do it because we had been like trained for X amount of years to do it on the up. Ugh. Anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think like if we wanted to say what might be a medieval form of training, right? Like you might play with maybe making a winding action in the right time and making a winding action in the wrong time, and not letting them catch you in the right time, right? Which sounds bizarre to do. But I think maybe you could play with that. But yeah, so that's what the exercises are, right? Which have nothing to do with what the dance moves are. The art is not the dance moves, nor is the practice the moves. The moves are just whatever they are for the dance. And I find some parallels with that with Lichtschneider as well. But that's maybe another talk. So romance, the other thing knights were up to, and their ladies, they weren't alone, and their dudes probably. So the hunt as an allegory for courtship was basically the primary allegory, right? And it was often falconry, because when I didn't mention earlier, whenever you're hunting with a bird, you're hunting with a female bird because they're bigger and stronger than their male counterparts. So if you're a male writer, it makes sense then to be writing about your female bird, right? And we actually still maintain bird and chick as words in English that we would use to refer to women potentially. But this is just a little bit of a little poem here that I thought was kind of cool. But yeah, there's a lots and lots of German medieval poetry that's love poetry talking about the hunt. And that's where a lot of our information about the hunt comes from, is actually from these poems. I don't know what more I really wanted to say about that specifically, but I did want, all right, so because Charles was very excited about this, at least on Facebook. So, all right, y'all, listen, if you want to laugh a lot, pick up this book, Erotic Tales of Medieval Germany, okay? This is freaking great, but I think also highlights how very different and yet very the same medieval stories and the idea of what was funny was compared to us. So I just want to read this one little story. It's very short to you guys. It's called The Funny Answer of a Young Woman. And I'll go ahead and read it without explaining the parts that maybe don't make sense, you'll get a lot of it, and then we can talk about the idioms that are in there and then how that might apply. So, once there was a friendly young woman near Friedberg who was as slyly experienced in all manners of life as a dice as a dice from Bergenhausen. That is, she was clever in all her doings. At some time I was joking with her, pretending that if my wife were to die, I'd like to take her in the holy sacrament of the laurel oil and marry her. She blew it all into the wind and uttered mockingly, "Oh my, by God's sacrament, oh dear no. I would not like it at all if he were to hang on my leg, oh dear." Then her grandmother got involved and said, "How could you find a better husband? You will never in your whole life win such a man, he who is such a good one." The little whore replied, "Yes, I have only said that I would not like to have him at my leg. What would he want to do for me there? A man belongs somewhere else, as everyone knows." With this, she gave to understand to all of us what she really wanted.
Wow.
Wow, it's a lot. But to have him at my leg is actually an idiom talking about, it's an idiom for being like dragged down, right? Like ball and chain, kind of, except for it's specifically referencing a way of tying hunting dogs up by tying their legs around us, like putting a stick between their legs and then tying their legs to a stick, like hobbling a horse, right? So they would hobble hunting dogs so that they wouldn't go hunting on their own. And that's what that's a reference to, right? So there's these layers, even these short little dirty stories that are referencing hunting traditions. And that's just common parlance. That's not even a knightly story necessarily. And so I think it's possible that when we're looking at our fight books, when we're looking at all this stuff, that we're going to see potentially these idioms occurring, and we don't necessarily know what they are. We don't know why vom Tag is vom Tag, right? From the day is stupid. It's stupid in English, it's stupid in German, it doesn't make sense. I suspect there's an idiom, right, that talks about vom Tag, but I haven't found it yet. So who knows, right? And it could be vom Dak, right? Vom Dak, from the roof, right? But Dak is also this part of a hawk, or a falcon. So when a falcon's in their stoop and they're striking down, right? That's the part that's coming down on top of the prey. So it could be a bird reference if it's vom Dak. So and again, Alber, like even at least the 16th century people couldn't agree on what the hell that meant, right? So idioms are being lost through time, and I think, through trying to gain as much cultural knowledge as we can understand how this thing was intended to be used, not only what it meant, and what the play is, but how it was intended to be practiced as much as we can understand about any physical art from a previous time. So I just wanted to end this with a little bit of a quote from one of those allegorical poems, but I kind of think of it as a little bit of a blessing to the hunter, however one may quest. Unleash their hounds, follow the trail, use a bow, hunt and shoot. Let it content you, whichever way it may direct you, right? And so, whatever your path is, and studying this art, may it content you. And that's just kind of where I wanted to let that be, and then open up for questions and discussion and trash talk and whatever we wanted to get into.
To go back to hunting, was the choice of weapon more related to game, apart from falconry, obviously, or was it more a case of this is how we do it today?
Mm-hmm.
This is just what we agree on, what we're going to train with, more or less.
Yeah. I think that all of those things would be considerations. So certainly there was amount of player's choice coming into this. But I do know that you know, there were certain spears that were more intended for, like, for instance, we think of boar spears, right, where they have the big langets going across the bars, that would, to help prevent the boar running up the spear and still goring you despite the fact that you're spearing it, right?
Oh yeah.
To protect against the afterblow, as it were.
Mhm.
And so yeah, so I do think that prey was definitely a part of the choice, but I feel like I've seen a depiction of almost every kind of prey with any kind of weapon. So I think the maybe the prowess or the skill of the hunter with the particular weapon might have been a piece of it, a piece of that decision. I haven't seen anything written that said why you might choose one or the other, I guess is what I would say.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Jess, I have a quick question. So we know about like, you know, Versetzen and things that you mentioned that specifically coming from hunting, but, and I guess the impulse, my impulse at least, is to map that one-to-one directly from hunting to, you know, to the glosses that we have. Is that, do you think, is that a safe assumption? Or, because now I don't know, I'm hesitant because you've been speaking about how you know, hunting terms can get into the popular lexicon and even change over time.
Yeah, so that's a really tricky question. It's one I battle with myself. So you can make a one-to-one for a lot of our German terms, straight to hunting. I would also say that you can also take a lot of those straight to castle parts. You can take a lot of them to, like, so siege warfare. You can take a lot of them to just, you know, because they are just words, right? So the trick is, as a modern person, we have a tendency to want to have a specific word for every single thing, and for that to be an individual jargonized word. And I don't think we can do that. So what I would want you to do is to look at the hunting stuff. Lager and Versetzen are both hunting words, right? So lager is when the animal is harbored, when it's in its lair, right? Lair being our closest modern English word to medieval lager in German. So the rabbit being in its warren, or the deer where it's lying down during the day, right? That sort of idea. So Lager and Versetzen, you know, absolutely are hunting words. But like I said, they're also kind of battlefield words. So what I would want you to do is to say this is a shading of meaning that this word enjoys. And so not that the only way to view this word is as a hunting word, and that it was necessarily borrowed from hunting to be a fencing word. I think that would be going too far. But rather that these words had a shared meaning across a lot of knightly pursuits, and that in that way, once you understand all the places it gets used and what those shades of meaning are, then maybe we understand the fencing meaning a little more clearly. Does that answer what you were asking, or did I go
Oh
someplace
yeah,
else?
yeah, absolutely. No,
Okay.
absolutely. Thanks. And real quick follow up. Do you have any recommendations for books about where we could find more information, like bibliography, or not bibliographies, but I don't even know what I'm talking about. But there's one I remember from some time ago. You posted on Facebook or something. It was like a German hunting like a glossary or something, and it has like a translation of these words.
Yep, that's this one. The Lexicon of the German Medieval Hunt by David Dalby.
Nice, thanks.
Yep.
So we're blessed here with the Library of Congress. We can find these things.
Excellent. There are not many copies of this one, so that's a good thing.
I believe I found a reprinting of it available online, though it looks monumentally expensive. So if you can find an extant copy, that's probably for the best.
Yeah, there were, I think, at the time I scored this one, like 7 originals in the United States for sale. So weirdly, not a lot of people are into German medieval hunting terms and their use. Bizarre. But yeah, you know, so there's all sorts of cool things you can look at. This is a cool book. The Cloisters was selling it, though I'm sure you can get it somewhere else. But these are sweet playing cards from the 15th century, and often these decks are literally all hunting things. So again, this was in their play, because we have, let's see what we have here. We have falcons, the lures for the falcons, the hounds, and there's something else, whatever the other court was for that particular deck. But almost all these decks are hunting decks, and so you can look at these for examples. Herons, right? The one of herons. So anyways, I would recommend this one as well. That guy's super sweet. He's a knight. He's my favorite knight. Look at that hat. So yeah, you know, just anywhere you look, you're gonna start to see that because their interests were in courtly romance, which was as much about being publicly seen courting someone as anything else, and public displays of badassery, right? You could kind of do that on the daily at a tournament or going to hunt, right? And at hunting and tournaments both, you had the opportunity to engage in your romantic pursuits. Whereas actual battle, while still important, and everybody would talk about it at home, like there were no chicks there to show off for, right? And that was just an important part of this class's approach to life. I am happy for any other questions, or if everybody's like, whoa, that was weird.
Would they have specific, so like you mentioned different prey types having a certain level of caliber.
Yeah.
Did they also have a similar approach to the territories in which they were hunting? Like, did they go to so-and-so's plot because it was the more challenging terrain, or?
Oh, I haven't asked that question. I don't know. They may. I know certainly there would be a certain amount of, like, if you were hosting the hunt, I guess it's like hosting a fancy party now. Like, you want to be a good host, so you would want the hunt to be successful. You want everybody to have a good time, right? But you would be showing off the prey that lived within your preserve, as well as the skill of your hunt master, right? Like, all of that would be a part of it, as much about showing off as anything. But I haven't read anything about terrain, so that's a good question.
Would they seed with particularly exotic animals if they were trying to, like, really pull out all the stops? So, like, yes, boar, stag, whatever, but would they, like, throw in a couple of rare birds just for fun?
Yeah, the birds are also kind of ranked by class, and so which bird of prey you had, like all of the birds of prey, all of the various varieties would be associated with certain classes. So eagles were things that only emperors or high kings could hunt with or should hunt with. Sparrowhawks were often for for women. There were even down to like which kinds of birds priests should hunt with. And there's a lot of there's actually a lot of complaints about bishops and priests and various men of the cloth spending way too much time and money on their birds and on birding instead of on the church.
Interesting. Well, there was a certain like vow of poverty or whatever that they had to acknowledge too, so I can kind of see that concern.
Right. But yeah, the birds are a new area of study for me. And what I'm finding is for all that I found a lot of, or felt like I found a lot of overlap between the ideas of the chase on the ground and fencing terminology and theory. I feel like there's even more in the falconry. It's just I have to learn so much more about falconry to understand it better. Because that's, it's a whole nother art, right?
So Joseph has a question. He says, my wife is wondering about spinning and weaving metaphors. So that's, for those who don't know, that Jess is a master at textile armors. His question is, he continues, he says, Travis Mayotte has mentioned such terminology in the context of fencing. Any thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, the one thing that immediately jumps to my mind is Lekushner describing, I think he's describing Ablaufen, if I'm remembering right. Ablaufen with the Messer, which he's describing as something, a motion like that with your hand that you make. But he says specifically that it is the motion that the women make when they are unwinding their yarn, or they're winding their yarn, winding or unwinding, I don't remember. And that's the motion you make with a niddy noddy when you're using that as a part of the going from the distaff to a skein is what that tool is for. So that appears to be what he's talking about. So there is that reference there, which is pretty cool. And also Lekushner, when he chooses new names for the four guards, right? He shifts to talking about castles and wild hunting animals, right? Or wild animals you would hunt, right? So a steer and a boar rather than ox and plow. So there seems to be, rather than a reference to the classes of society and the four guards, he shifts to talking about the top of a tower and the bastion, right? So some things happen with our allegories through the art for sure. Mm-hmm. But that's the only one I know of that talks about spinning or weaving or anything like that. Even winding, right? Winding is also, or vinden is also, they would call it ringing up in modern falconry, but it's when the falcon is circling like this and getting higher and higher and higher in preparation for its dive to attack. So, I mean, we think of winding as maybe related to rope or thread or something, but I don't know that they would have made that exact connotation.
So we had two questions pop up. Brent asks, do we know what 15th century people would have considered good fencing to look like? You touched upon that a little with the desirable qualities of a fencer in the Paulus Call picture, and I was wondering if you knew more about that.
Yeah, I don't know what we know besides, again, like, the random trash talk that occurs, but in our fencing manuals. But even then, when they're trash talking, they don't tell us that much about what is undesirable about what people are doing. I think it's left to us to determine the inverse of that, i.e. they tell us what they want, and therefore the opposite would be what we wouldn't want. But I don't know of anywhere that discusses it explicitly. You know, one thing that I mean, we can take context clues from the culture, right? One of the qualities of the lion, just because I was reading up on this stuff today, right, in preparation for this, but one of the qualities of the lion that some of the writers talk about is that it will not attack a captive or a man on the ground, right? And that's part of what makes it noble. So that implies to us a certain approach that it would not be desirable to fence somebody who was in some way constrained, or was clearly so much your inferior, right? You know, it's desirable to fence someone that's better than you always, right? Because that says a lot about you. But as far as specifics in the fight, that's, I don't know. That's harder to say.
And then he says thank you. And then we have Kendra. Is the hunting term for releasing a hawk different from the word for releasing a horse's reins or a dog's leash?
No, hanging. Hanging is the word, which we should know from our fencing vocabulary, right? Is finnin and hanging. And so it's because you're letting the bird's jesses hang. You're no longer winding them up around your hand and keeping them constrained. And then when you are casting the hawk, oh, I don't remember the word for that right now. I don't think it's Shisen. I think Shisen is only bows. I'll have to look real quick, Kendra. Talk amongst yourselves. Nope, I'm not finding it now. Kendra, if I track that down, I will let you know. I cannot remember the word for actually casting the hawk off. One, two. Nope.
Kendra's question was the result of attempting to understand the senses of hanging that aren't hang toward the ground. And Kendra hasn't found a Latin hunting treatise except about falcons.
Right. You know, Dalby, when he's talking about hanging, he also, like, it would have to be like knock hanging, or something like that, where it had some sort of preposition associated with it. But that it could also be shooting along the trail after game. So it isn't even necessarily just the physical act of hanging, right? It seems to have a broader meaning of running free, if that makes unconstrained, if that makes sense.
So Spencer here has a really cool question. He asks, or they ask, regarding flirting, courting and showing off at hunts? Was this an idea that men were putting forward to each other in the vein of, quote, the ladies love it when you do X at the hunt? Or do we know if women of the time generally found these things actually impressive and attractive? Related, were these sorts of social events more for showing off and getting someone's attention by your accomplishments? Or was it more like an excuse to spend a leisure day together? Both or neither?
Yeah, I would say probably both. I think all of these things would happen. You know, mostly I have spoken of these poems as having a male narrator, though that was not always true. There are poems using the hunt or the falcon, the rearing of a falcon, that allegory where it's a female author and referring to her lover as a falcon. And so, you know, I think both sexes were engaging in this. To the amount of willingness, I think that's probably just, you know, that's just humans being humans. But the point of pride was to gain the attention and affection of the woman, perhaps privately, but also publicly. So the idea of giving a favor at a tournament, right? And women would give out favors, you know, not necessarily just to their lovers, whether that be, you know, with physical consummation or not, right? Because it's a very nebulous thing in this time, and we can't always know. But, you know, certainly there's one particular poem that stood out to me the other day that, you know, I could read real quickly, but it's a woman discussing her lover. She says, "My falcon's taken flight to lands far off from here. The bird I reared so long ago is now held tight by strangers' hands, I fear. Too slack I left the jesses that kept him safe and true. Now like a nettle in vain remorse distresses, my heart it burns through. And yet I hope he will return anon, though now so far he roams. When his plumes break and when his bells are gone and winter's menace comes, when hunting time is over and all the hedges bare, he'll wing his way back to his corn and cover and fly no further from there," right? Which is kind of heartbreaking a little bit, you know. But yeah, she's like, yeah, he freaking left me for some chick somewhere and he'll come back someday, hopefully, you know, in winter when he's having a hard time eating and getting mistreated. So, you know, but and there are a lot of poems written around this idea and the idea of losing a hawk or losing a falcon, because they were such expensive birds. And even now, they're never truly domesticated or tamed. They basically just are willing to fly for you for a couple of years, and then whenever they figure out that they can leave, they do. So that's kind of the thing of falconing, is that you have these very expensive tools, weapons, birds that you're using that'll just bail on you whenever they decide to. So I think that's part of why it became such a useful metaphor for, you know, the vagaries of romantic engagement. I know I went a little off topic there, sorry.
All right, any other questions? If not, I've got like kind of a closing question, but I want to give others a chance to chime in if they have any.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so do you have any, my question's a little bit broad, do you have any advice for people who are thinking about trying to explore context generally, maybe not even hunting, but you know, that they know they want to do something like this because they're interested in the period, they want to make a contribution to fencing, but they don't know where to start.
Mm.
Do you have any advice for these types of people?
Damn, that is a good question. Yeah, right. So my research approach is pretty is pretty kind of shotgun, right? So what I'll do is, get something stuck in my craw like the feet of a hind, and I'll start basically Google booking it, right? Which will, especially if you're searching German terms or for German ideas, will bring you up a whole bunch of stuff you probably can't read. But eventually you're gonna hit upon something, and from there I will bibliography jump, right? And start going after anything and everything I can find of interest. Some, I was just telling somebody the other day, it's an old book, but it's a really good one, A Distant Mirror. Of course, it's very, Anglo-centric and talking about French and English traditions primarily, medieval traditions. But I think it's a really useful start at just like, I just need to read about, the Middle Ages a little bit. I think that's a very good book. One that I blew my mind, and I'm going to read again pretty soon here, is The Medieval Machine. Again, it's an older book, but it's talking about, it ends up talking about all of the different ways that medieval Europe was not primitive. And I think sometimes it's easy for us to think of it, as everyone's in brown sackcloth or weird studded leather and like, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not wrong. And that people are in some way unsophisticated, I guess is what I want to say. And The Medieval Machine, talking about things like having stock markets in grain mills on the river, and how people would battle for who could put their grain mill where, because you can only have a mill so close, or the water doesn't run fast enough to run the mill anymore. And then you start having lawsuits about property rights over where somebody's putting a mill, and having entire rivers completely stop because there's been so many mills put on it, right? Like this kind of level of both, social and economic and technical complexity, being just kind of like your everyday, what's just going on down the street. It blew my mind, because I until that book I hadn't really thought of the Middle Ages as being like that. So I think those are a couple good, really general starts. After that, I would just choose literally like, what is the thing you're interested in, and then just go after it. As soon as we're not all COVIDed up, start going to specialist libraries if you can. The music library or music and dance library at the University of Kansas, which is down the street from me, is where I started getting into all this music stuff, because I was able to go and just like thumb through their medieval section, and see what those books might have to offer. And then that leads me down other places. So that's, that's my approach, which maybe isn't for everyone. But I think it's not a bad way to go if you're just kind of trying to get a feel for a thing.
Cool. All right. Well, any last questions before we let Jess go?
Just one quick one. What was
Yeah.
the dancing book that you had mentioned earlier, the Italian one? I didn't see the title, sorry.
Yes, the title is On the Practice or Art of Dancing, and it's edited by Barbara Sparti, S-P-A-R-T-I. There's her name. And I think I just grabbed this off Amazon, I think. And there it is.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And oh, I totally should have mentioned this. In this book, in the back, there's some writings of a different dance master, and he's talking about. They call it an autobiography. It really isn't. It's him being like, I went to this really cool party and that really cool party, and I met this guy and shook his hand. And like, it's a list like that of things he did. But he talks in here about, oh, I don't have it highlighted. Why didn't I highlight it? He talks in here about at a wedding, some Germans showing up and fencing for the joy of it, and one of them died.
Because of the fencing or because of something else?
No,
Oh,
because of the
jeez.
fencing. One of them killed the other one, and they were like,
Oh,
damn.
man.
And he was like, I was at that party. I saw that. It was crazy.
Incredible.
Oh, my God. So, yeah. So, I mean, these dance masters were movers and shakers, so they're going to run into the kinds of people we're interested in learning about. So anyways, fascinating stuff. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks
Thank you
for
very
doing
much,
this.
Jess.
Excellent. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
I'm gonna hang around a little bit more.
Okay, I thought I would, Charles, just in case you and I had any wrap-ups for once it was,
Oh,
a thing.
no. I mean, no. I people can still chat and hang around.
Oh, okay. Well, I can hang out for a minute.
Or yeah. Oh, okay. No. I think we're good. Yeah. I mean,
I just
you
didn't
need
want to
to-
make anybody sit here and wait on me if they thought some cool shit was going to happen or
oh.
something.
Well, I've always found that the coolest stuff always happens after the official.
Right? That's a cool
Yeah.
book if you want a 16th century book, Charles.
Oh, which one is that? Oh,
It's-
music discipline. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Music, Discipline, and Arms in Early Modern France is really cool. And the author is Kate Van Orden.
Are you familiar with the book Bloodied Banners by Robert Jones?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Oh, okay. All right. I was considering getting it, and first, like, I figured you would at least know of it.
Yeah, no, I haven't. Sorry, I heard a knock, but it was nothing. Yeah, no, I haven't looked into that one yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because he's talking like in the or she is talking, excuse me, in the Music, Discipline, and Arms book. There's a discussion of like music as the measure of all things, but talking about academics and military academics and how you would be let me see if I can find it here. Oh yeah, so the instruction was that you should, like in these universities, and this is like 1611 in France, and they're saying that you would study riding and running at the ring every morning, and fencing and dancing, tumbling and mathematics on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then on Saturday afternoon, you would do drawing and music. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a man of letters would show up and make you learn moral virtue and politics. Like, those are the worst days. But I mean, that's really cool. Like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you were doing fencing, dancing, gymnastics, and math. Right?
Yeah.
How cool.
Here's a. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Go on.
no, go.
Oh no, I was thinking like just kind of jumping off of our conversation from like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
It really forms a picture of masculinity or of gender, like, oh, these are the things that you do, and this is how you do them well. These are the qualities that we expect, not just in your practice of the activity, but also as like being a man in that role. It's kind of hard to separate the activity from also kind of the person's place in society. And what's interesting to me is that each of these activities and looking for the ideal qualities seems to form a picture of gender that's very different from the kind of picture that we're trying to place onto it, that most modern people will try to place onto the badassness of sword fighting. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't know, man. It's all a, I don't know. It's hard to know, right?
Yeah.
And we don't have a lot about, you know, what was expected of everyone else, right? Beyond like really basic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, obviously women should be virtuous and pious, and you know what I mean? But like, it feels like there's a lot less active direction.
Yeah.
But oh, you know what? I have to make a run because my kids are knocking at the door.
Okay. Cool. All right.
All right.
Thank you
you
very
so
much,
much,
Jess.
Charles. All right. We'll see you later.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.